Hello, Max here, the editor, founder, and scriptwriter of these channels, Mr. at Horns and Cold Crime Cases. So basically, I make content for these channels. So enjoy the video, like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for watching.
Deborah Leah Trops was born in Florence, Oregon on June 4, 1958. In the 1970s, she attended South Salem High School before her family moved to Spokane, Washington, where she joined the Honor Guard and even rode on a float with the then-president, Richard Nixon. She was described as sweet, and high school is where she met her future husband, Robert Trops. After graduation, her family returned to Salem, and Deborah began pursuing an accounting degree at Chemichetta Community College. The couple didn't have a child of their own, and even as the marriage soured, they decided to adopt. In 1988, 30-year-old Deborah became a new mom, soon to be a single one. That July, the couple separated. Deborah moved back to Salem to be near her parents and into the Cambridge East Apartments. She worked as a bookkeeper, and custody exchanges became part of life. Divorce felt inevitable, and arrangements for custody and child support for baby Rihanna were on the horizon. Tuesday, November 29, 1988. After work at Willen Incorporated in Sherwood, Deborah drove to a 5:15 p.m. hair appointment in Tigard and left around 7. The plan was ordinary. Stop by Robert's place in Sherwood, pick up 7-month-old Rihanna, and head home. She never made it. Around 9:30, Robert began calling friends, family, and 911 to report her missing. Calls, he said, came from his home phone. Investigators later found no record of those calls and concluded he likely wasn't at home when they were made. On November 30th, several Beaverton locals noticed a new black 1988 Honda Accord, oddly parked at a dead end off Southwest Murray Boulevard, near Southwest Joel's Ferry Road. The driver's window down and no license plates. Nothing looked obviously wrong, so no one caught it in. On December 1st, a city worker did, mainly because of the location, a new car abandoned at a remote construction site in the cold with a window down. It was Deborah's car. When officers opened the trunk, they found Deborah deceased, her clothes caked in mud. The same mud was smeared on the hood, steering wheel, gear shift, and front right tire. It appeared similar to the mud in the front yard of the log cabin where Robert was living, the place Deborah was headed to pick up the baby. Authorities released the vehicle back to the lender before further testing. The medical examiner determined Deborah had been manually strangled before being placed in the trunk of her car. Detectives learned she and Robert were still married but separated, and that she was preparing to file for divorce. Friends and co-workers described troubling behavior, controlling and sometimes physically violent, and said Deborah had confided she was scared. She had allegedly started a relationship at work with unmarried co-worker John Pearson, and Robert had confronted her about it. Deborah told John that if Robert found out, he would kill her. Decades later, on November 28, 2022, Pearson went to a bar, got drunk, and led Crook County Sheriff's deputies on a chase. He was charged with several crimes, including eluding, failed to appear for trial on March 15, 2024, and later moved out of Oregon. Months after the failure to appear warrant, deputies located him at an RV park in Mojave County, Arizona, where, while they were attempting to serve a material witness warrant, he took his own life. Prosecutors later said he was depressed after losing his son, and he believed he was too ill to survive incarceration. They also said there was no evidence linking him to the crime, and his wife backed his alibi that he was asleep at home. He had cooperated and voluntarily provided a DNA sample. In 2020, detectives pulled Deborah's boxes back onto the table. Detective Kevin Winfield located additional witnesses and sent clothing and soil collected in 1988 for modern testing. DNA was found on the collar and neck area of Deborah's coat and was consistent with Robert's, but ultimately inconclusive. The FBI compared mud from Deborah's car with mud from Robert's property. The samples were described as indistinguishable. Investigators also documented that Robert sold roofing materials at construction sites near where the car was abandoned. Context that suddenly felt important. When Winfield interviewed him again in 2022, Robert's account conflicted with what he'd said decades earlier. A grand jury indicted him, and he was arrested for second-degree murder 34 years after the crime. The trial in early 2025 lasted 3 weeks. In April, a Washington County jury found 70-year-old Robert guilty of second-degree murder. On July 8, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Deborah was an Oregon woman who loved quiet things, fresh air and a good trail. That was taken from her. The record now says what happened and who did it. Robert lived free for nearly 4 decades. At sentencing, Rihanna, an adopted infant then, now an adult, spoke about losing the father who raised her, a stark measure of how many lives this crime bent across the years. Matthew John Dunmire was 31 when he died in March 2021. Nothing in public reporting points to a violent past, certainly nothing like what he'd later be accused of. In 2017, Chelsea Perkins reported to Virginia Beach police that Matthew sexually assaulted her. Detectives said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges, and the claim remained an allegation. For years later, early March 2021, during a night out, Matthew told coworkers he planned to meet a woman he knew previously and had reconnected with online. A message came in. His supervisor watched him step outside and get into a white smart car, later tied by plate readers to Perkins's household. There's no indication she posed as someone else. She arrived in her husband's smart car, and the short-term rental was booked in her own name. They spent the night there. The next morning, March 6th, she drove him to the Terra Vista Natural Study Area in Valley View inside Cuyahoga Valley National Park. They walked past the old cemetery, stepped off the trail, and moved into the trees. In that quiet stretch of woods, she brought a 9mm handgun and fired a single shot. Because it happened on federal parkland, the case landed in federal court. Late that morning, hikers reported hearing one shot. Another pair met a woman later identified as Perkins, dressed in black with knee-high boots, asking for directions to the cemetery. 3 days later, around 11 a.m. on March 9th, hikers found Matthew's body near Terra Vista Cemetery. An Aquafina water bottle sat beside him. Perkins didn't linger. That same day, she messaged a Detroit-area tattoo artist that she was in Cleveland and needed to make a stop first, then drove to Michigan to get a tattoo of a noose on her forearm before returning east. Toll and travel records back up that trip. Investigators built the case piece by piece. GPS logs, surveillance video, and phone records put her with Matthew and inside the park. Plate reader hits tied the white car to her household. A search of the Virginia residence turned up 3 9mm pistols. Forensics identified DNA from both Perkins and Matthew on the Aquafina bottle. Agents also recovered a deleted note on her phone crafted to look like Matthew had written it himself, created around the time his body was found. Ballistics analysis was part of the evidence set. The digital trail, physical evidence, and the staged note all pointed the same direction. 9 months after the discovery, on December 9, 2021, agents arrested Perkins in Pensacola, Florida. Grief inside Matthew's family spiraled into something tragic that fall. On November 5, 2021, frustrated there'd been no arrest, his mother, Tommy Lynn Dunmire, disguised herself as a delivery driver in Washington, D.C., and shot a woman she mistakenly believed was connected to her son's death. The victim survived. Tommy later died by suicide. Her longtime partner, John Nelson McQuillan, pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and was sentenced to 42 months in prison, followed by supervised release. Perkinson's path drew attention on its own. A stint in the Coast Guard, then subscription-based online adult content under an alias. In May 2025, facing the evidence, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and to using a firearm during and in relation to a violent crime on federal property. On September 9, 2025, a judge sentenced her to 22.5 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. People sometimes ask, did she kill her best years later? The precise answer is this. She killed a man she had accused in 2017 of sexual assault. He was never charged. He was never convicted. Matthew was remembered as a free spirit who loved music, loved playing his guitar, and loved being with his friends. Ria Rasmussen was born on June 15, 1976 in Orange County, California. She was only 2 to 4 years old when her life was taken and her remains placed in a barrel on a wooded lot near Bear Brook State Park in Allentown, New Hampshire. For decades, she was just the middle child. Now she has her name, and with Ria identified, all 4 victims in this case finally do. Authorities announced the identification in early September 2025, closing a gap that began with 2 grim discoveries. Inside the first barrel were an adult woman and 2 young girls. The woman was later identified as Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. The children, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters, were Marlise's daughters. 15 years later, in 2000, a second barrel was discovered shockingly close to where the first one was found in 1985. The barrel contained the remains of a third child, who became known only as the middle child and remained unidentified until now. Ria was born in 1976 in Orange County, California. How investigators reached Ria's name is a story of patience and modern forensics. In 2024, New Hampshire State Police partnered with the DNA Doe Project. Genealogists built a family tree with roughly 25,000 people. A key DNA lead pointed to an obituary mentioning a daughter named Pepper Reed. With Pepper's name in hand, investigators found a 1976 Orange County birth record for a baby girl, Ria Rasmussen, daughter of Pepper Reed and Terry Rasmussen. A family DNA comparison made it official in early September 2025. Ria's parents anchor the rest of this story. Her mother, Pepper, was born in 1952 and raised in Texas. She hasn't been seen since the late 1970s and is presumed to be one of Terry Rasmussen's victims. Ria's father, Terry Peter Rasmussen, born in 1943, moved through states and aliases for years. Investigators believe he killed Ria and also murdered Marlise Marie and Sarah. Rasmussen died in prison in 2010 while serving time behind bars for an unrelated California murder conviction. A few human details help Ria stand apart from the paperwork. Officials note she likely had darker hair than the other girls and a slight overbite. There's no known photographs of her, only reconstructions and the science that finally brought her name home. Rasmussen's trail threads through multiple identities. In New Hampshire, he was Bob Evans. In California, he used names like Gordon Jensen and Larry Vanner. In 1986, he abandoned a little girl, long known as Lisa, at a Santa Cruz area trailer park. Years later, DNA would reveal she was Dawn, the daughter of his then-girlfriend Denise Bowden, who vanished from Manchester, New Hampshire in 1981, and is still missing. In 1999, he met Eunsoon Jun in Richmond, California. In 2002, he murdered her and left her under a pile of cat litter. That conviction finally put him behind bars. Here's where the case still needs help. Investigators are mapping Rasmussen's movements from 1974 to 1985, especially across New Hampshire, California, Arizona, Texas, Oregon, and Virginia. Pepper's disappearance remains an active case. Denise Bowden is also presumed dead. Detectives believe there are likely more victims. And because cases echo into other stories, a public tip once tied to Barabrook didn't solve the barrels, but it did help identify another New Hampshire teen, Elizabeth Liz Lamont, whose remains were found in Tennessee in 1985. Officials have said there's no reason at this time to link her death to Rasmussen, but it shows how one investigation can open doors for another. Ria, Marie, Sarah, Marlise, for names restored after decades, 2 women, Pepper and Denise, still missing, and a strange daughter, Diane Klopfer, whose father left when she was 6. She was able to provide DNA in her 40s when she learned her father was the Bear Brook killer. Robert Gary Spoor was born on February 4, 1951 in Imperial, California, and went by his middle name Gary. He met Wendy Wood in college and they married in 1976 and moved through life as a team. In the late 70s and 80s, they lived in Afghanistan and Hong Kong. Years later, they settled on Lake Tahoe's west shore in Homewood. Big windows to the water, high ceilings, travel photos everywhere. Their dog, Maggie, wandered the kitchen like she owned it. 50 years together, 45 married. June 5th, 2021 felt like an easy late day. Their older daughter, Erin, stopped by with the boys 1 3, 1 8 months. They hung out by the water. Gary started dinner upstairs. Around 7:45 p.m., Erin loaded the kids to head back to Reno. Wendy slipped her a $90,000 check to help with the indoor riding ring. What nobody inside knew. Hours earlier, cameras caught a hooded person in a white mask and a backpack near Hurricane Bay. They crossed Westlake Boulevard and went up the driveway. No broken glass, no forced entry. Someone slipped in and waited. After Erin left, the shooter came out. Gary, 70, was killed with a .22 caliber round. Wendy, 68, was shot twice in the head and once in the hand. She managed to dial 911, but couldn't speak. When deputies arrived, they found Gary near the upstairs living area by the fireplace and Wendy in the bathroom, barely hanging on. She was flown to a hospital in Reno and spent about a month in the ICU. Wendy had significant brain damage. She had to relearn basics, walking, talking, eating. For day-to-day help, she later moved into an assisted living facility to keep working at recovery. She tried short hikes, handwriting practice, but trauma lingers. In March 2023, at that facility, she took her own life. The family believes the shooter took both of their parents. Detectives focused on how deliberate this was. No similar break-ins, nothing ransacked. Cameras showed the masked person arriving well before the 911 call. Over time, pieces lined up, shell casings, a blood drop in the garage, sightings in Nevada the night before, and phone data tracking movement toward Tahoe. Investigators came to believe Samantha Scott, close to Erin and by then involved with Erin's husband, drove with him toward the lake. Samantha later admitted she drove him to Tahoe City and said she thought it was a drug run, not violence. Motive talk wasn't new. Money stress, resentment, a nasty fight over $1.3 million, tied to a ranch property and renovation. There were messages and earlier threats, including one where he allegedly said he'd kill them one day. There was a long pattern of financial help from Gary and Wendy, right down to that $90,000 check that afternoon. And prosecutors said he'd gotten a $70,000 dream car check weeks before. 2 years to the day after Gary's death, June 5th, 2023, civil suits hit. Adrian, the younger daughter, sued Erin and her husband, alleging a conspiracy. Erin countersued, saying Adrian manipulated their mother to change the family trust. The court put the civil case on pause while the criminal case moved. October 20th, 2023, former Major League Baseball pitcher Dan Serafini, Erin's husband, was picked up in Winnemucca, Nevada. Samantha Scott was arrested in Las Vegas. Placer County worked with the U.S. Marshals and local agencies. Charges for Serafini included murder, attempted murder, burglary, and child endangerment because 2 small kids had been at the home earlier. Scott was initially charged alongside him. By February 2025, Scott pleaded guilty to being an accessory. She'd already been locked up about 16 months and was released with credit for time served. Serafini kept his not guilty plea, so the case went to trial. Trial started mid-May 2025 in Auburn and ran about 6 weeks. Jurors heard about planning and lying in wait. They heard witnesses say he'd talked about paying to have his in-laws killed, then later said he'd do it himself. Scott testified she drove him toward Tahoe and watched him test a crude plastic pipe silencer. The defense pushed back on the grainy video and an FBI height estimate. The masked person looked about 6 feet 2 inches, which they argued didn't match him exactly, and they attacked Scott's credibility because she took a deal. Closings wrapped in early July. On July 14, 2025, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder for Gary, guilty of attempted murder for Wendy, and guilty of first-degree burglary with special circumstances, including lying in wait. He was found not guilty of child endangerment. Sentencing was set for August 18th, but has been delayed because his defense requested a continuance to consider a motion for a new trial. Around all of this, more context surfaced. Erin said she and Serafini sold their Sparks bar, the bullpen, a while back, and that he'd been working in underground mining in Nevada. His baseball career, Twins, Cubs, Padres, Pirates, Reds, Rockies, ended after a steroid suspension and money was tight afterward. In Tahoe, Wendy spoke up on housing, standing with locals as short-term rentals changed the area. The family lived in that West Shore home for 17 years. Lake Tahoe was their calm. Adrienne became the voice for her parents, press conferences, interviews, $150,000 reward. She's talked about punching a hole in drywall the day it happened and sleeping in hospital chairs while her mom relearned the basics. When momentum dipped, she pushed. As the case moved, other personal details came out in court. Aaron and Serafini met through horses years before they married. Their relationship with Wendy and Gary was often tense. Cutoffs and reconciliations, a post-nuptial agreement, and repeated fights about money and property. By 2021, the anger in messages had sharpened. The investigation itself took time. Tahoe hadn't seen a local homicide in about 2 decades. Early on, there wasn't much to go on besides the masked figure on video and the lack of forced entry, which pushed detectives towards someone who knew the house. It stalled, then moved again with warrants, phone records, hotel footage from Elko and Scott's cooperation. She said she waited in a car for hours while he hid in the house, then drove him back after the shooting. She said he later broke down the gun and tossed parts into a ravine after crossing into Nevada, and that he threatened to kill her if she talked. She kept ties with Aaron for a while after, even traveling with her to Mexico in 2022 for elective surgery. Where things stand now, Serafini's been in custody since the guilty verdict. Samantha Scott is out after her accessory plea with time served, credited on the front end. The sister's civil case is still paused, and Adrienne keeps going. Filings, hearings, steady updates, carrying her parents' story forward. Edward Frank Adams was 65 in 1987, living on Rabbit Hill Road in Wellsburg, West Virginia. Living with him was his 25-year-old son. The morning after Thanksgiving, November 27, 1987, he was found dead from a gunshot wound. Authorities treated it as a suicide. The death certificate handled it in Ohio because Adams was pronounced dead at an Ohio Valley hospital in Steubenville. Listed a self-inflicted bullet wound. For nearly 4 decades, the case sat. Then, on November 10, 2024, Edward's son, James Edward Adams Sr., called 911 and said he was responsible. Later that day at the Chester Police Department, with deputies from Brooke and Hancock counties present, he described shooting his father as he slept, wiping the weapon, and letting first responders and investigators believe it was suicide. During the interview, a deputy wrote that Adams threatened to kill his roommate if he wasn't arrested, statements that led to a separate charge of making terroristic threats. A grand jury indicted him, and less than a year later, on September 15, 2025, he stood in court, reaffirmed his confession, and pled guilty to first-degree murder. Judge Jason Cuomo sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence he could have received at trial. In court, Adams referenced prior time in an Ohio prison and a traumatic brain injury as a young adult, and said he'd carried this for decades. It all began in the spring of 2024 when Aaron Spencer's daughter was just 13 years old. She was homeschooled and was described as a quiet individual. She was also helping her mother care for her dying grandpa. Because that came with a lot of stress, her mother allowed her to spend time with trusted family friends in order to get a break. One of those family friends was dating 66-year-old Michael Fossler, who was a veteran former police chief in Indiana, and former school resource officer. Unfortunately, he had an ulterior motive. He obtained Aaron's daughter's phone number and began texting her, and that's how the grooming began. By July, her parents were informed by a family member that their now 14-year-old daughter had confided that she had been sexually assaulted. Immediately, her parents asked what had happened, and she explained that Fossler, whom they weren't familiar with, had assaulted her sexually multiple times. They quickly turned to authorities for help and were promised that things would be taken seriously and that Fossler would be held accountable. At first, it appeared he was. He was quickly arrested and charged with 2 counts of internet stalking, 2 counts of 4th-degree sexual assault, 2 counts of sexual indecency with a child, possession of a computer with inappropriate material involving children, and 35 counts of pandering, or possessing media depicting sexual conduct with a child. Even with all those charges, the judge allowed him to be released on a $5,000 cash bail with no supervision. While this made the Spencer family nervous, they figured his felony charges and the no-contact order would be enough to keep him away. Sadly, that's not how things played out. Meanwhile, Heather put her daughter into therapy and tried her best to manage her trauma, while still caring for her own dying father. Then, on October 8, 2024, everything came crashing down. At about 1:12 a.m., Aaron and Heather were awakened by their dog barking. Heather immediately asked Aaron to go check on their daughter, and they were shocked to find her gone. Heather called 911 while the rest of the family looked around the house for her. Then Aaron received a text from his sister, which included a photo of a cash-out payment for DoorDash from Fossler to Aaron and Heather's daughter a day or two before. That's when they realized he most likely was involved in their daughter's disappearance. Aaron, desperate to find her, rushed out of the house, got into his vehicle, and began searching for her. Before the police could arrive, Aaron located Fossler's white Ford F-150, turning onto Highway 236 east toward Fossler's home. He turned around and chased after Fossler's vehicle, flashing his lights and honking his horn to get Fossler to pull over. When the two vehicles arrived at the intersection of Highways 236 east and 13 north, rammed his truck into the rear of Fossler's, sending the F-150 into the ditch. Aaron stated that he exited his vehicle with his firearm in hand and ordered Fossler out of his vehicle and to lie down in the ditch. He said he then observed his daughter trying to exit the passenger side of the vehicle, but it appeared that Fossler had grabbed her and stopped her from getting out. Aaron then stated that Fossler exited his vehicle and had something in his hand, but Aaron didn't know what it was. He said all of a sudden Fossler lunged towards him saying, "You." Aaron reacted by pistol whipping Fossler before shooting him multiple times, fatally injuring him. Once Aaron felt the threat was over, he got his daughter out of the vehicle and returned to his truck, where he called 911 and told them about the events that just unfolded. Investigators determined that Aaron shot Fossler in the chest, arms, and abdomen. It's likely that had Aaron not stopped Fossler, he would have never seen his daughter again. While most people saw Aaron as a hero, the state disagreed and charged him with first-degree murder, which was later downgraded to second-degree murder with a firearm enhancement. Apparently, Fossler had other victims as well, but no justice was ever served in their cases either, and he was allowed to continue his crimes against children. The first accusation against him came in 2022, after his wife of 44 years passed away, and continued from there. Thankfully, he can never hurt another innocent child again. While the Spencer family now tries to pick up the pieces, they are left in agony over Aaron's arrest. It doesn't help that his murder trial is being overseen by Judge Barbara Elmore, who allowed Fossler to go free on such a low bond. She also strangely issued a gag order in the case, preventing the defendant, attorneys, law enforcement, and potential witnesses from speaking about the case, and sealed the entire court file. Many are calling her gag order unconstitutional. Before the gag order was put into place, Aaron's attorneys, Aaron Casanelli and Michael Kaiser of Little Rock, released a statement saying that Aaron was not a criminal for protecting his child from a predator who repeatedly violated her. After his attorneys spoke out in support of Aaron is when the judge implemented the gag order. On May 29, 2025, the Arkansas Supreme Court vacated Judge Barbara Elmore's broad gag order. Several justices filed unusually strong concurrences criticizing how the case was handled, with one justice explicitly urging reassignment to a different judge. However, the court rejected the reassignment and Elmore remains the judge on the case. As of now, the pretrial is scheduled for December 17, 2025, with a jury trial set for January 26 to January 30, 2026. Other judges have also been critical of Judge Elmore's decision to implement a gag order, especially one that was far too broad and too restrictive of speech, unconstitutionally vague, and could even prohibit the speech of any public official now holding office. Other judges also noted a troubling pattern of attempts to shield this case from public view. Heather has stated that more than $100,000 has been raised for her husband's legal fees in less than a week, and any additional funds will be donated directly to the Wade Knox Children's Advocacy Center. Hussein Abdu Murray, who went by Sam, was born in 1952 in Lebanon. As a child, he moved to the United States and graduated from Hamtramck High School. He eventually married a woman named Linda, and by the age of 72, they were living a quiet life in Rochester Hills, Michigan. Sam was described as an amazing cook, grandfather, and gardener who enjoyed sharing his fruits and vegetables with his many friends and family. His grandson, named after him, described him as a man with a heart of gold who treated all those around him with kindness and compassion. The Murrays owned gold and glitter jewelry and Hamtramck, as well as a luxury pawn shop specializing in jewelry. On October 11, 2024, at 10 p.m., two men posing as DTE utility workers checking a gas leak rang the Murrays' doorbell and asked to come in, or DT, check out for gas leaks. Sam and his wife declined, saying it was too late. The next day they returned, and this time were allowed to enter. They wanted to make their way to a basement, and that's exactly where Sam took them. Once down there, the men bound him with duct tape before beating him to death. They then turned upstairs and demanded money, jewelry, and the location of the safe from Linda. She immediately asked where her husband was, to which they responded he was asleep. However, upon noticing the blood on them, she began screaming, causing one of the men to strike her while trying to cover her mouth. Just like Sam, they bound her with duct tape. After that, they searched the home and took her phone, watch, cash, and other jewelry, and then left in a white truck with a DTE sign on the side. Thankfully, she was able to free herself and call the police. When they arrived, she told them she thought her husband had been kidnapped. However, officers would find him dead in the basement with bruises, lacerations, and wounds consistent with blunt force trauma. The medical examiner ruled that the cause of death was asphyxia due to neck compression. Police used footage from a Ring doorbell to identify the suspects as Carlos Hernandez and Joshua Zuazo. Hernandez was captured the next day in Shreveport, Louisiana, and Zuazo was located and arrested 3 days after the murder in Plymouth Township, Michigan. Both men were charged with first-degree murder and 2 counts of unlawful imprisonment. Come to find out, Hernandez had included his wife in the planning, and investigators discovered that through text messages between them regarding counterfeit DTE materials. Some of those text messages read, "The badges were delivered, your account is still negative." I'm assuming this is referring to the DTE badges they ordered. Hernandez's wife also sent a text to him that read, "What if he's not home?" To which he replied, "He will be." And yet another message, she said, "I'm so nervous, but you guys seem to have it down. I feel better now that you have a good getaway car." While both men pleaded not guilty, prosecutors had more than enough evidence, including the men's DNA on the zip ties used to bind Sam in the basement and the traces of blood found on their clothes. They were also able to track down the origins of the 2 magnetic DTE signs on their truck. The signs were made and purchased from a Detroit graphic artist and business owner who was able to provide video surveillance of the customers who picked up the order, and it resembled Hernandez and his wife. The owner of the business had come forward after hearing about the horrible murder and wanted to make sure investigators knew he wasn't involved. Those signs were later found inside the home of Hernandez's mother-in-law. Video was also recovered from Allos and showed Hernandez and Zuazo buying duct tape and zip ties in the self-checkout area. Plus, they had text messages between the men planning the attack. In court, Zuazo's attorney blamed the entire crime on Hernandez, citing his financial struggles and the fact that he had only been married to his wife for a year and wanted to buy a new house. Regardless of who was the mastermind, both men were found guilty of all charges, including first-degree murder, on October 3, 2025. Their sentencing is scheduled for December 9, 2025, and prosecutors are seeking a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Jayla Lavea Bass was born on November 26, 2016. At the age of 5, she lived with her parents, Jermaine Lavanda Bass, Shirley Princess Bass, and her 8-year-old brother, JJ, in the Armature Gate Townhomes in Tampa, Florida. She was a kindergartner at Piso Elementary School and enjoyed being a mini cheerleader. On August 29, 2022, Shirley called 911 from their home in the 13,000 block of Heritage Club Drive in Tampa to report a shooting. When officers arrived, they found Jayla in the bunk beds she shared with her brother, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. JJ had also been shot, but was thankfully alive. He survived and now has to live with a bullet lodged in his head. As for the gun, it was still in the children's bedroom, along with 5 spent casings. It belonged to their father, Jermaine, who claimed he was trying to unload the magazine when the gun accidentally went off 5 times, hitting both his children's heads as they slept. Obviously, investigators weren't buying this, and he was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Jermaine had a lot going against him. First, prosecutors argued that most accidental gun discharges are a single bullet, not 5. There's also the fact that when officers arrived, they found Jermaine holding his son, JJ, who had been shot in the head. When asked if anyone else was injured inside the home, he told officers no when J. Lutt was clearly dead upstairs. Plus, crime scene photos were inconsistent with his account. In the end, he was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, first-degree attempted premeditated murder, and aggravated child abuse. As family members read their heartbreaking statements, Jermaine didn't shed a single tear. Then, when given the opportunity to address the court, he never mentioned Jayla, not even once. When all was said and done, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Logan Haley Federico was born on January 20, 2003 to parents Stephen and Melissa Federico and raised in Waxhaw, North Carolina. She was described as an energetic, strong, and fun-loving individual who never hesitated to stand up for the underdog and causes she cared about. At the age of 22, she was attending South Piedmont Community College, where she was pursuing a degree in education with the goal of becoming an elementary school teacher, all while working 2 jobs and living in Waxhaw. On May 3, 2025, Logan was hanging out with friends about an hour and a half from Waxhaw in Columbia, South Carolina. That night, they went out before returning to her friend's home on Cypress Street in the Old Shandon neighborhood. Unfortunately, as they slept, a man broke into a nearby home and stole a firearm, wallet, and keys to the owner's vehicle. After leaving that home, he set his eyes on the house where Logan was. With the stolen gun in hand, he burst into the home and entered Logan's bedroom where she was sleeping. He attacked her, dragged her out of bed, forced her to undress and get on her knees, all the while begging for her life. The man was Alexander Devontae Dickey, and he had a long criminal history that included 39 arrests and 25 felonies dating back over a decade. Sadly, Logan wouldn't survive, and after being executed, Dickey fled the scene with her debit and credit cards in the vehicle he had stolen from a nearby neighbor's house. He then went on a shopping spree with her cards. As he was driving near Gaston, South Carolina, in the stolen car, he crashed and forced his way into a nearby home. He then tried to set it on fire before officers were able to extract him through a window. If you're wondering why he wasn't behind bars, considering his high amount of convictions, well, that's because of Judge Bentley Price, who is also known as Judge Catch and Release. He approved Dickey's release in early 2024 after only serving 22.5% of his 5-year sentence on a first-degree burglary charge that had been downgraded to third-degree burglary for an unknown reason. Also, his rap sheet was missing all of his prior burglary convictions because other agencies didn't enter the data. If they had entered the data, it would have shown on his rap sheet, and he most likely would have been sentenced to a minimum of 15 years. Eventually, Judge Price was ruled unqualified by the South Carolina bar and not renominated. He vacated the bench in June 2024 and in September 2025 was rebuked by the South Carolina Supreme Court over a separate case. Dickey is now facing 12 state charges in Richland County, including murder, 2 counts of first-degree burglary, and 2 counts of possession of a weapon during a violent crime, plus 23 additional counts in neighboring Lexington County for arson, burglary, and financial crimes. He's being held without bond and could face the death penalty. At this time, he remains in prison awaiting a trial date. Michael Scott Rogers was born on November 21, 1993. At the age of 16, he lived in Transylvania County, North Carolina, and unfortunately, his attendance at a house party would prove deadly. On the night of February 20th, 2010, Michael's friend Krista Rickards asked him to accompany her to a house party so she wouldn't have to go alone, and he agreed. The party was a secret and was being hosted by 19-year-old Scott Fisher at his parents' home on Holiday Drive in Henderson County while they were out of town. While there, several people were underage drinking and doing drugs. Michael had allegedly started drinking beforehand, and by the time he arrived, he was already drunk. As he continued drinking, he became belligerent, and his drunken behavior began annoying those around him. He was telling people that he had been in 2 mental institutions and was addicted to drugs. It's unclear if any of that is true. At around 11 p.m., he called his mother and stepfather and asked them to come pick him up. He called back a few minutes later, crying, and said, "They done beat the hell out of me. I'm laying here and bleeding all over, and I just pray to God they don't come back and kill me." After his mother received that frantic call, she spoke with Scott Fisher, who agreed to drive Michael down to the Blantyre Baptist Church, a quarter-mile away, to meet her. She also called 911 and asked someone from the sheriff's department to meet her at the church. However, when they arrived, nobody was there and the deputies began searching for Michael. Upon searching the Fisher home, they didn't find Michael, but found blood drops and a bloody towel inside. They then called Scott's father, Sean Fisher, to inquire about Michael's location. Sean said that his son had called him and said that he had dropped Michael off at the end of the driveway. But Michael wasn't there either. They still hadn't made contact with Scott, who had left the home and not returned. Upon a second call with Sean, he told the deputy that his son might be with a woman named Ashley, who drove a silver Volkswagen and lived in an apartment on King Street in Brevard, North Carolina. The investigating officers rushed over there, arriving a little after 3 a.m. There, they found the silver Volkswagen and along with another deputy, they observed blood spatter spots and blood stains in the car. Inside the apartment, they found a few people, including Scott Fisher and a man named Richard Thomas. Both Thomas and Fisher were questioned by the police. Thomas said that Michael was driven and let out near Highway 64 and King Road, then headed to Grove Bridge, just over the Henderson County line. Fisher initially said Michael walked away near the intersection, then admitted they drove to the boat access where they continued beating him before leaving him in the cold. Fisher went on to tell investigators that Michael arrived at his house in a wild state. He said a brief initial fight broke out between Thomas and Michael. Thomas had allegedly hit Michael, knocking him over the railing, resulting in a cut lip. Fisher then admitted that later on, he punched Michael numerous times, even as he was in and out of consciousness on the floor. Coleman Hall also allegedly got in on the beatings. Fisher's father had arrived at the home after Fisher's uncle called him and told him that he had seen Michael on the ground, beaten up, and told him he had to get Michael out and away from the house. That's when they put Michael in a vehicle and said they were taking him to meet his parents. 2 witnesses reported seeing Hall and Fisher hit Michael near the boat access and said they even threw rocks at his head. In that vehicle was the driver Coleman Hall, who went by Coley, his passenger Scott Fisher, and 2 females. However, instead of going to the church to meet his parents, they drove about half a mile down Grove Bridge Road to the Blantyre Bridge and boat access. Once there, they forced Michael out of the vehicle and beat him again. They then left him shirtless with no cell phone. After that, some of the members of the party burned their clothes in order to destroy evidence. Late the next morning, officers spotted Michael's body in a hog pasture off Grove Bridge Road. He was muddy, wearing jeans but no shirt. The medical examiner could list no single injury that caused Michael's death. It did, however, state that hypothermia was the cause, exacerbated by alcohol and non-fatal injuries. Although alcohol was present, no illegal drugs were detected. There were also no injuries to the brain, bone fractures, or internal injuries of any kind. Toxicology showed blood alcohol of 0.06 and urine alcohol of 0.15, a pattern consistent with declining blood alcohol by the time of sampling. While many were involved in the events that led to Michael's untimely death, only one was arrested, Scott Fisher. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter in January 2011. In May of 2012, he was found guilty and sentenced to 19 to 23 months in prison. Many feel that others should have been charged as well. Since Michael's death, Coleman Hall has been in and out of jail, but never charged with Michael's death. Sadly, Michael's Garden Memorial was damaged by a 2024 hurricane. However, someone with a kind heart restored the cross and added extra memorial things to it. Although some justice was served, many believe that it fell short of the amount of justice Michael deserves. Carmen Hope Van Huss was born on October 9, 1973 to parents James and Andrea. In 1993, 19-year-old Carmen was a student at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and worked at Pizza Hut. She was described as a very caring individual who loved animals and often took in stray cats. She was also an art lover, which is what led her to pursue an art degree. The spring semester was going fine until Carmen failed to show up for work a couple of days in a row. At 10 p.m. on March 22, 1993, Carmen left her father's home and returned to her apartment. Neighbors that night said they heard an unidentified man enter her apartment, followed by a loud fight 2 hours later. Another neighbor heard Carmen scream, "Get off me! Get off me!" followed by the sound of footsteps leaving the apartment and running down the hallway. 2 days later, on March 24th, a co-worker of Carmen's called her father and notified him that she had failed to show up for work. Worried, he began trying to call her, but there was no answer. So he drove to her apartment and knocked on the door, but once again, nothing. He then decided to let himself in and shockingly found Carmen's bloodied body and quickly called 911. When officers arrived, they discovered signs of a struggle with the table being knocked over, clothes thrown on the floor and a large pool of blood near her head and blood on the walls. Investigators determined the killer had stabbed her over 60 times using a pocket knife and a screwdriver. The neighbors, who heard the fight 2 nights earlier, never called the police, but instead reported Carmen to the apartment's office staff. While she lay dead in her apartment, the staff placed a note on Carmen's door, asking her to keep the noise down and be more considerate of her neighbors. Sadly, after the murder, Carmen's stepmother, Sherry Van Huss, had to clean the blood up in the apartment. Unfortunately, at the time, investigators were unable to track down her killer, and the case would go unsolved for the next 31 years. They had looked at her boyfriend and ex-boyfriend, but both were out of town on the night of the murder and ultimately ruled out. The first time DNA was analyzed in the case was in 2000, when investigators asked for her DNA to be entered into state and national databases. Then, in 2009, they were able to eliminate a witness who was also considered a potential suspect. 4 years later, in 2013, DNA evidence from a bag found in a trash can and a bloodstain from the can itself was investigated further, and unknown male DNA was discovered. From there, a profile was generated and uploaded to Cody's, but no matches were found. In 2023, with help from Pearbon Nanolabs and genetic genealogy, investigators were able to narrow down the suspect to 52-year-old Dana Jermaine Shepard, who would have been 21 years old at the time of the murder. He also lived in the same building as Carmen. When investigators tracked him down, he was working as a custodian for the University of Missouri, and was visibly shaking when investigators approached and asked for a DNA swab. Finally, on August 30th, 2024, he was arrested and charged with Carmen's murder after the test results showed his DNA matched the DNA from the crime scene. He had 3 charges, one for murder, for knowingly killing another person, another for felony murder, for committing a felony during the course of the murder, and the last one for the sexual assault of Carmen. Shepard was no stranger to the law, and in 1992, he was arrested for public intoxication. Then, in 1996, he was arrested for battery in Indiana. In 2001, he was charged with stealing in Missouri and then for peace disturbance in 2009. Then, in 2013, he was charged with driving on a highway without a license. Sadly, her father, James, never got to see the case solved, because he died in a car accident in 2002 at the age of 49. As of September 2024, Shepard is still awaiting the outcome of the case. Major Melvin was born on December 31st, 1934, and in the 60s, he met and married his girlfriend, Claudette, who was described as an authentic and loving individual. In the 1970s, they moved from Virginia to Fort Lauderdale, where they raised their 11 children, some of who were from previous marriages. Before Major retired, he worked as a backhoe operator, while Claudette worked as a housekeeper at a hospital. By 2024, 89-year-old Major and 87-year-old Claudette had been married for 60 years, had 28 grandchildren, and were well loved by their family and the community. Unfortunately, a horrible tragedy would change the family's lives forever. On the evening of March 22, 2024, at around 8:47 p.m., Claudette's sister came by the couple's home and discovered that both Major and Claudette were dead and quickly called 911. When investigators arrived and entered the home, they found the couple shot to death. It appeared to them that the shooter came through the front door and caught Major off guard. He quickly tried to get up, but got tangled in the blanket on the couch. Claudette heard the noise, and as she was rushing out of the bedroom, she was shot as well. Her mentally disabled brother also lived in the home and was unharmed. He said he had spent the last 2 days sleeping in one of the rooms and watching MASH. He was the one who discovered Claudette's body when he went to grab something to eat. He immediately called his sister and told her it was an emergency and she needed to come quickly. When asked why he didn't call 911, he replied, and I quote, "No one taught me how to call 911. Sadly, he was unaware that his sister Claudette and Major were dead. When the investigator explained what had happened, he broke down crying and hugged the detective. Unfortunately, he never heard gunshots or loud noises before finding her. Investigators combed the scene and found several shell casings scattered on the floor. They also found paperwork with estimates for pest control and homo innovations in their granddaughter, 34-year-old Jaleesa Hill's room. They then discovered that the couple's red 2014 Ford Fusion was missing. Almost 2 weeks later, on April 4th, a man flagged down a Fort Lauderdale police officer to inform him that he had seen the Melvins' car at a towing business he worked for. Investigators went to the tow lot and confirmed it was the Melvins' Ford Fusion. They then got a search warrant to question those who worked for the towing company in hopes of finding out how the car got there. The tow truck driver who towed the car and said his boss sent him a text around 6:30 p.m. on the day of the murder and said a Ford Fusion was for sale and needed to be picked up. When he went to get the car, he asked the man why he was selling it, and the man responded that he was tired of putting money into it. He asked if there was anything wrong, and the man said nothing. He then bought the car on his boss's behalf for $200. About a week later, the tow truck driver saw on the news that investigators were looking for a 2014 Ford Fusion and believed it was the same car he bought. He informed his boss and the police were called. Once investigators learned the location of where the driver met the man selling the car, they went to look for surveillance cameras. However, even after that, they were not able to determine the seller's identity, at least not yet. On April 9th, investigators spoke with the couple's granddaughter, Jaleesa, who had stayed at the house the night before the murders. They specifically asked her about the pest control and home renovation estimates they found in her room. She responded that she was set to inherit the house if they died and was making plans to fix it up. This was a red flag for investigators who couldn't understand why she was already making these plans when the couple wasn't even dead yet. A week later, on April 16th, investigators had the car's black box removed, and it revealed that it started up around 3:25 a.m. on the day of the double murder. It was then driven to the Tri-Rail station where it was left until the towing company bought it the following day. While they were suspicious of Jaleesa, they still needed to find the man who sold the car. 9 days later, on April 25th, police were able to confirm the identity of the man as Maurice Nuzin, Jaleesa's boyfriend. When investigators asked the family about him, they said after the murders, he was coming around asking questions and acting strange. They also discovered that Newson had worked for Spirit Airlines as a ground crew chief, but was fired in January of 2024 after being arrested on December 30th for battery. On May 16th, Jaleesa was given a polygraph exam and failed on the question of whether or not she was involved in the death of her grandparents. She then walked back her statements about being next in line for the home and said she was never next in line. Court documents actually back this up, and it's believed that Major told her he would give her the home, but it was never official. She most likely didn't discover this until after they were dead. She was also asked about the car, but said she couldn't remember the last time she drove it. However, investigators discovered that she had filed an insurance claim after the murders on behalf of her grandparents and never told the insurance company they were dead. She did express concern about the payment being addressed to Claudette, most likely worried that she wouldn't be able to cash it. She was then asked about Newson, but said they were no longer dating and that she hadn't seen him in a while until he walked by her grandparents' home the day after the murders while she was sitting on the front porch. However, investigators didn't buy her story, and on May 23, 2024, they arrested Jaleesa and 30-year-old Newsom and charged them both with the double murder. Jaleesa also received charges for stealing and selling the car. After their arrest, investigators discovered that Jaleesa had sent Newsom $1,000 via Zelle. They assumed that was the payment for the murders. As of September 2024, both Jaleesa and Newsom are awaiting the outcome of the case. Khaleesi Hope Kutry was born on December 5, 2016 to parents Amanda Mullen and Ted Kutry. She was described as a very sweet child who was also very empathetic. Unfortunately, Amanda had been addicted to meth for the last 15 years, and in October 2020, she was arrested on a probation violation. She then worked with CPS to determine where Khaleesi should go. She was not allowed to stay with her biological father or Amanda's sister, who had her own CPS case at the time, so she reached out to her friend Candy Royer, who agreed to watch over Khaleesi while she served her 2-year sentence. Amanda thought Royer's home would be good for her because there was another 3-year-old there that she could play with. However, Royer and her boyfriend Travis Brown were addicted to meth and heroin, and leaving Khaleesi in their hands was the biggest mistake of Amanda's life. Royer lived in Waynesboro, Virginia, and was on house arrest at the time. Since she couldn't leave the house, CPS took Khaleesi and dropped her off at the home, unaware that Brown also lived there. However, it's unclear if that knowledge would have actually made a difference because later on, CPS denied they were ever involved in the placement of Khaleesi. Over the next few months, the sweet and cheerful Khaleesi began to change. She was growing skinnier and paler and had visible signs of bruises and burns on her body. In a video taken in January of 2021, balding Khaleesi can be seen so frail that she can't even stand. Amanda was unaware of the abuse and was being told by Royer and Brown that Khaleesi was doing fine, but they needed more money to care for her. She was able to speak to her daughter on the phone and through text messages, but then one day that communication suddenly stopped. Anytime she asked Brown and Royer to speak to her daughter, they gave her the runaround, saying she was either not there or was sleeping. Amanda became frustrated, and in March of 2021, she asked Khaleesi's father, Ted, and her cousin, Daniel Mullen, to deliver money and a cell phone to the Royers' home so she could speak with her daughter that way. However, nothing changed. Royer and Brown eventually stopped answering her calls altogether, so Amanda filed a request with the CPS to do a welfare check on Khaleesi. The CPS employee who was assigned the case called the home received no answer and never tried again. In August, Ted gave the couple more money, even though Amanda hadn't spoken to her daughter since January. The following month, while Amanda was still behind bars, she saw a news report that Royer was missing. In a panic, she went to the jail guards and explained that she had trusted Royer with her daughter but hadn't heard from her since January and was now afraid something was seriously wrong. They let her call the sheriff, who in turn opened an investigation into Khaleesi's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Amanda contacted friends and family to see if they knew anything. Royer had told some of the family that Khaleesi went to stay with a grandmother or aunt in Covington, Virginia, while she told others that CPS had picked her up. In an effort to find the now missing Royer, the sheriff ran her information and discovered that she wasn't actually missing, but instead was with Brown, hiding from police after they had committed a series of crimes, including stealing a car, passing bad checks, and drug-related offenses. It also turns out that Brown was wanted by police in 5 different jurisdictions for a total of 14 different charges, including strangulation, grand larceny, and assault and battery against a family member. A manhunt got underway, and on September 12, 2021, the couple was arrested at a motel in Pennsylvania. Found with them was the stolen car, along with drugs and stolen checks. However, Khaleesi was still nowhere to be found. The sheriff then filed felony child abuse charges against Royer and traveled to Pennsylvania to question both her and Brown about Khaleesi's whereabouts. When Brown was interviewed, he said he may have smacked her because it was something she allegedly enjoyed. However, he wouldn't give a straight answer regarding where she was. First, he said that CPS came and got her. Then he changed his story and said a friend took her. He then tried to tell investigators that she had taken her own life. Brown continued with his claim, saying that Khaleesi had died accidentally after striking her head. So he wrapped her in a blanket and put her in the trash. He also said before her death that she tried to strangle his own daughter. On September 20th, 8 days after their arrest, a search warrant was executed at their home. Inside, they found a bent wire hanger wrapped in electrical tape with Khaleesi's matted hair stuck in it. Also in the home were multiple blood samples on the wall that linked back to Khaleesi. They had the wire hanger tested for DNA and it linked back to Royer. At this point, they figured Khaleesi was most likely dead and had been strangled to death by Royer. During the trial, they were able to prove that Royer was the main abuser. They even had video proof of her yelling at Khaleesi in the shower, telling her that no one liked her. Brown, on the other hand, had been mean to Khaleesi, but allegedly never part of the physical torture that Royer subjected her to. Interestingly, it was also revealed that Royer had been having an affair with a then-deputy of Augusta County Sheriff's Office, Dylan Johnson, the same office that was investigating Khaleesi's disappearance and presumed murder. In the end, Royer and Brown pleaded guilty in Pennsylvania to the possession of meth and stolen checks, and were sentenced to 2 months to 1 year in jail. In 2022, they were indicted for the murder of Khaleesi, unlawfully concealing her body, conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and conspiracy to conceal a dead body. Brown also had additional charges for child abuse, resulting in serious injury. They were then extradited back to Virginia to stand trial. In August 2023, Brown was convicted of aggravated murder, felony murder, and child abuse. 2 weeks later, Royer decided not to stand trial and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The other charges against her were then dropped. It's insane to think that Royer was allowed guardianship of Khaleesi with her long history of convictions that included drug possession and addiction, robbery, and theft. It's also sad that CPS lied and said they were never part of the plan to have Khaleesi stay with Royer. When Brown was sentenced, Amanda made a final plea for the location of Khaleesi's remains, but he stuck to his story that he didn't know. He was then sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years for the child abuse charge. Investigators believe that Khaleesi's remains are in a landfill and will likely never be found. During Brown's statement, he said he took no part in Khaleesi's horrible death and said he was only focused on getting high. In February of 2024, Royer was sentenced to life in prison. Khaleesi stood 3 feet, weighed 40 pounds, and had blonde hair and blue eyes. And as of September 2024, her remains have not been found. In the summer of 1994, 10-year-old Marie Chantal Desjardins had just recently moved to a suburb of Montreal called Sainte-Thérèse when a horrible tragedy occurred. On July 16th, she spent time at a local snack bar that had pool tables before riding her bike to a friend's house. At about 9:30 p.m., she decided to head home but sadly would never arrive. She was last seen heading east on the same street as the snack bar. A massive search got underway, and 4 days later, on July 20th, 1994, her body was found 20 minutes away in a wooded area behind the Place Rosemy shopping center. She had sadly been strangled to death and possibly sexually assaulted. Found near her remains were her bike and keys. Unfortunately, with no suspects, the case would go unsolved for the next 30 years. In 2023, the case was reinvestigated and DNA collected from the scene was sent off for advanced testing and forensic genetic genealogy. From there, investigators were able to identify the suspect as 61-year-old career criminal Rael Courtemanche, who was already behind bars at La Macaza Institution Prison over 2 hours from Montreal for another crime when he was charged with Marie Chantal's murder. That crime occurred in 2011, when he climbed into the car of a woman and kidnapped her. He then held her against her wheel, threatened to kill her, and drove her into a wooded area. In total, he had 89 convictions over a 30-year period, including assaults, theft, and drugs. Then, in 2015, he was declared a danger to society and incarcerated indefinitely. After being charged with first-degree murder for the death of Marie Chantal, he pleaded not guilty. I did read that he passed away before being convicted, but I wasn't able to confirm this. Selena Hernkind was born to Julie Hernkind and Matthew Poppy on October 19, 1998, and was immediately placed in foster care. Meanwhile, her parents agreed to take a 12-week parenting class, and in addition, Matthew agreed to go to anger management. The two had met when Matthew was a police cadet in the 122nd Precinct on Staten Island, and she worked at the station house. After getting together, they married and he took her last name. They then had a total of 5 children together, including Selena, and both quit their jobs. The children in their home were constantly being removed and placed in foster care, only to be returned to the nightmare of living with their parents. The first reported abuse and torture of their children started in January of 1997, when someone had called saying they had placed a baby outside in the freezing temperatures with no clothes on. However, Children's Services would later deny the allegations. In July 1998, the children were removed from the home after their daughter Diane was brought to the ER with bruises all over her body. When medical staff questioned Julie about the bruises, she lied and said that Diane had hit herself with toys and was bumping into her crib. They were then arrested and charged with assaulting and endangering the welfare of Diane. The charges were later dropped due to a lack of evidence, even though they had been investigated 6 times before this incident. The abuse continued, and in 2001, the children, including 3-year-old Selena, were still living with their parents in Stapleton, New York. Plus, Julie was 7 months pregnant with her 6th child. One of Selena's visits to the hospital was for a broken femur that her parents said was the result of her falling out of a bunk bed. She then sadly had to be put in a body cast. Unfortunately, the hospital took them at their word and a terrified Selena was sent back home with them. On November 5, 2001, the abuse would turn deadly after Selena, who only weighed 22 pounds, sold her pants. To clean her, they used a wire Brillo pad which caused severe pain. As she begged them to stop, held her head under cold water in the bathtub until she died from asphyxiation. This is a very abbreviated version of what happened because the actual details are too gruesome to include in this video. After she was dead, Julie called 911 saying she knew she had gone too far this time. Selena's ultimate cause of death was asphyxia, and when Julie and Matthew were brought in for questioning, they confessed to the murder. In the end, Matthew was sentenced to 15 years to life, but has since been released on parole. While behind bars, he was allowed to earn a bachelor's degree in psychology. Julie, on the other hand, was acquitted for second-degree murder, but convicted of first-degree manslaughter and given 25 years in prison. From what I can tell, she was released in October of 2022. Kyra and Leah Christopher were 15-year-old twin sisters with bright futures ahead of them. They were students at Helix High School in Lemon Grove, California, balancing academics with their love for basketball. Their mother, Joan Hoyt, described them as kind, caring, and full of life. But in April 2020, their lives were cut short in a horrifying act of violence at the hands of someone who they once trusted. On April 15, 2020, Dwayne Edward Groves Jr., Joanne's ex-boyfriend, stormed into their home with a gun. Joanne had broken up with him about a week and a half earlier, and his response was pure rage. He called her just before the attack, telling her he had a plan and to trust him, but there was no warning for what came next. Moments later, he shot his way through a sliding glass door and immediately opened fire upon them. He shot Kyra first before moving through the house and killing Leah. He then turned his attention to Joanne's oldest son, 22-year-old Gary. He brutally beat Gary with the gun, leaving him with a broken arm and deep wounds to his head. Meanwhile, Joanne grabbed her younger children and fled the home. After attacking Gary, Groves fled the scene, trying to escape capture, but police found him hiding in a backyard just a few houses away. His gun was still at the scene with the serial numbers scratched off, a failed attempt to cover his tracks. Before leaving the house that night, he left Joanne with chilling final words. You always wanted a story to write. Now you have a book. When it came time for justice, Groves pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and an assault charge for attacking Gary. In court, Joan spoke about how her family was torn apart and how her surviving children still suffer from the trauma of that night. In the end, Groves was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole plus an additional 72 years. The School for Boys, later called the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, was a juvenile reform school run by the state of Florida from 1900 to 2011. Located in Mariana with a second campus opening in Okeechobee in 1955, it was once the largest reform school in the country. Over a period of 111 years, it became infamous for horrific abuse, including physical beatings, sexual assault, torture, and even murder at the hands of staff. Despite multiple investigations and promises of reform, the cruelty and mistreatment never stopped. Abuse at Dozier was reported as early as 1903, when children were found shackled in leg irons. Investigations over the years revealed shocking conditions, including a 1914 dormitory fire that killed at least 6 students, a 13-year-old boy dying in 1934, just 38 days after being sent there for trespassing and overcrowding with kids locked up for minor offenses like truancy or smoking. In 1968, Florida Governor Claude Kirk visited the school and was horrified by what he saw, saying someone should have blown the whistle a long time ago. At the time, the school held 564 boys, some as young as 10. Even though corporal punishment was officially banned that year, reports of violence, brutal beatings, and unexplained deaths continued. By the 1980s and 1990s, more stories of torture and mistreatment came out. The ACLU sued over cases where boys were hogtied and kept in isolation for weeks, and the Department of Justice stepped in to monitor Florida's juvenile justice system. In 2009, after Dozier failed a state inspection, new investigations confirmed ongoing abuse. After years of trouble, the school was finally shut down in June 2011. Even after it closed, dark secrets kept coming to light. Concerns about missing boys and unmarked graves led to an investigation in 2012, led by forensic anthropologist Erin Kimmerell from the University of South Florida. Her team found 55 burials, many outside the official cemetery, and uncovered records of nearly 100 deaths. By 2016, 7 DNA matches and 14 presumptive identifications had been made. In 2019, during a pollution cleanup, 27 more suspected graves were discovered, prompting Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to launch another investigation. One of the most infamous parts of Dozier was the White House, a detention building constructed in 1929. In the 1950s and the 1960s, it became the site of brutal beatings where guards whipped boys until they lost consciousness. Former students, now known as the White House Boys, later came forward to share their stories. One survivor, Jerry Cooper, recalled being beaten 135 times with a leather strap when he was just 16 years old. Others said they saw boys die from their injuries or locked inside industrial dryers as punishment. The state sealed the White House in 2008 and placed a memorial plaque there. In 2017, Florida officially apologized to Dozier survivors. The next year, the legislature approved funding for memorials in Tallahassee and Mariana, as well as financial restitution. In 2024, a bill sponsored by Representative Michelle Salzman and Senator Darrell Rouson was passed to compensate survivors and their families. Even today, men who endured the horrors of Dozier continue to fight for justice. In 2025, more than 800 survivors applied for restitution, and the Florida legislature allocated $20 million to be split among them. The legacy of Dozier's atrocities even inspired Colson Whitehead's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Nickel Boys, which was adapted into a film in 2024. The story of Dozier remains a dark chapter in Florida's history. For over a century, boys sent there, many of the pettiest of reasons, suffered unimaginable abuse. Even though the school is now gone, the scars remain and survivors continue to demand justice for those who never made it out. Kathleen Ruth Smiley was born on May 22, 1957 in Florida and went by Kathy. By 1974, 16-year-old Kathy was now living in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, where she was known as a friendly, warm, spirited, and ambitious girl. She had moved with her family to the area a few years prior after spending time overseas. She was a senior at Lakeside High School in DeKalb County, where she was recognized for her academic drive, taking extra classes to graduate a year early. Kathy had big dreams, initially aspiring to become a veterinarian, but later considered teaching as a career. Despite her ambitions, Kathy's life was shaped by the complexities of her family circumstances. Her parents, Dale and Jacqueline Smiley, had recently separated, and her father had moved to Minneapolis for his job. Kathy, her younger sister Patricia, and their mother had stayed behind in Atlanta. Regardless of his relocation, Kathy's father, a corporate marketing representative for Gillette, was still a significant part of her life. The weekend of April 20th, 1974, was when Kathy was looking forward to because her father planned to visit for a family day at Lake Lanier, where they would picnic and swim. The morning after arriving, Kathy and Patricia drove to a Denny's restaurant to meet their father for breakfast. Kathy had just turned 16 the previous year and was given a red 1972 Volkswagen Beetle as a gift. After breakfast, Kathy's father agreed to take Patricia with him to the lake while Kathy was to go home to retrieve her swimsuit and water skis. Sadly, it was the last time Patricia and her father saw Kathy alive. After parting ways at the restaurant, Kathy made a quick phone call to her mother, letting her know that she would be heading home soon to grab a few things before joining them at the lake, but she never returned. Kathy's path took her to an access road near Interstate 85, where she encountered two men, Pinckney Thomas Mitchell and Wallace Charles Lanford, both fugitives from North Carolina. They were looking for a way to get back to their home state, having recently escaped their respective troubles. Mitchell and Lanford, both in their early 20s, were desperate for money and drugs. After meeting Kathy, they convinced her to help them by offering her some gas for her car in exchange for a ride to North Carolina. Kathy, trusting or simply not thinking of the danger, agreed. She drove her red Volkswagen to a nearby Shell service station on Shellaford Road, where the men bought gas. A clerk recalled that Mitchell, who seemed fidgety and out of place, was acting oddly as he asked about the route to Lake Lanier and North Carolina, requesting a map of the area. At the same station, Mitchell took a rope from the ground, secretly pocketing it as he made small talk. After filling the car, Kathy, Mitchell, and Lanford drove away from the station unaware of the impending violence. Somewhere between Shallowford Road and the exit toward Lake Lanier, the two men overpowered Kathy. They pulled her off the road and drove her to Gaston County, North Carolina. Once there, they took her into a wooded area near the old Lincoln Academy where they sexually assaulted her. In a statement later given to authorities, described how he had sexually assaulted Kathy before Lanford took his turn. The violence escalated and Mitchell, fueled by drugs and anger, viciously attacked Kathy, stabbing her repeatedly. After killing her, they tied her lifeless body to a tree, leaving it in the woods as they drove away. They returned to the area hours later, where they attempted to cover up their crime by burning Kathy's car and disposing of the evidence. Mitchell, in the presence of Lanford, later bragged to his brother-in-law Stuart about what they had done. He admitted to the murder, describing it as a big one. This confession was later used against them during their trial. Kathy's body was found later that afternoon, about 5 hours after she was last seen. Her body was discovered by a passerby near the old Lincoln Academy, where she had been left dead, bound and gagged with an electrical cord. The brutality of the crime shocked the local community. The Volkswagen, which the men had set ablaze, was discovered burned beyond recognition. Their subsequent attempt to cover up their involvement failed, and soon the police had enough evidence to arrest them. During their trial, it was revealed that Mitchell had a criminal history. He had previously been convicted of crimes such as traffic offenses, assault, and larceny, and had escaped from a correctional facility in North Carolina. Despite the chilling details of the murder, the defendant's defense strategies varied. Mitchell claimed he didn't remember killing Kathy, attributing the violence to a drug-induced haze, but his statements and actions left little room for doubt. Lanford, although admitting to being present at the scene, denied participating in the assault, but his presence and the evidence pointed to his complicity in the crime. In the end, both were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. However, the death sentences were later commuted to life in prison. Both Mitchell and Lanford have since passed while still in prison. The haunting nature of her death, combined with the eerie atmosphere of the Lincoln Academy site, led to rumors that Kathy's spirit still lingered in the woods, a tragic figure trapped by the violence she suffered. In the 40 years following her death, the location where Kathy was killed has become infamous, with many visitors reporting strange occurrences and an overwhelming sense of sorrow hanging over the area. Whether these reports are rooted in truth or simply the product of a community's grief and fear, Kathy's memory has lived on. Though the murderers were eventually caught, the emotional toll of Kathy's brutal killing continued to echo through her community for decades. The horror of that day on April 21, 1974, is one that still lingers in the hearts of those who knew her. Nadine Jersenki was born in the early 1970s and spent most of her life in Toronto, Canada. By age 26, Nadine was working at a local strip club and was described as a young woman navigating life like many others her age, unaware of the brutal fate that would soon befall her. On May 8, 1999, police in Lincoln, a small town in Ontario's Niagara region, responded to a call about a disturbing discovery. Around 5 p.m., uniformed officers arrived at Victoria Avenue near 8th Avenue, where a passerby had spotted the partially clothed body of a woman lying in a roadside ditch. That woman was Nadine. It took authorities 2 weeks to identify her, finally doing so after releasing images of her face to the public and receiving crucial tips. Investigators quickly determined that Nadine had been strangled to death. However, despite collecting DNA evidence from the crime scene, no matches appeared in any existing databases. From the outset, detectives believed her killer was likely a truck driver, leading them to check truck stops between Niagara and Mississauga, where Nadine worked. In 2006, years after Nadine's murder, police charged Michael Durant in connection with 2 separate murders. One involving an exotic dancer whose body was discovered in a wooded area in January 2006, and another involving a sex trade worker who vanished in August 2003. Given Nadine's profession and the similarities in victim profiles, investigators considered whether Durant might be linked to her case. However, he was eventually ruled out as a suspect. For years, Nadine's case went cold. Despite exhaustive efforts, consulting national DNA databases, collaborating with Interpol, and coordinating with agencies in the US and UK, no significant lead surfaced. In 2021, new hope emerged. Advances in forensic technology offered investigators an opportunity to revisit the case through genetic genealogy, a method unavailable when Nadine was killed. The Niagara Regional Police Service Homicide Unit teamed up with the Toronto Police Service Cold Case Unit, the Centre of Forensic Sciences, the Chief Coroner's Office, and Ontario's Ministry of the Attorney General to apply these cutting-edge tools to the lingering mystery. The killer's DNA profile, initially collected at the crime scene, was sent to a US-based laboratory specializing in genetic genealogy. In 2023, their efforts finally paid off when the killer was identified as Joseph Archie Brousseau, who went by Raymond. Unfortunately, I was unable to find a photo of him. Brousseau was a truck driver originally from New Liskeard, a town in northern Ontario. He was 34 years old at the time of Nadine's murder and died in 2017, years before police were able to confirm his involvement. Investigators were able to obtain a DNA sample from Brousseau posthumously and compared it to the DNA left at the crime scene, and it was a match. Further investigation revealed that Brousseau matched the original profile built by police. He had worked as a long-haul truck driver for many years, traveling extensively across Canada and the United States. There was also evidence indicating that Brousseau frequented the Niagara region during his trucking routes, though no records suggested any prior connection to Nadine before their fatal encounter. Detectives now believe Brousseau likely picked Nadine up after work and killed her shortly after. His DNA has not been linked to any other unsolved cases in Canada's national DNA database, and no additional crimes connected to him have surfaced. 1993, Soul Asylum's Runaway Train music video featured images of 36 missing children in the U.S. version, aiming to raise awareness and aid in their recovery. The video became a groundbreaking effort, with over 70 missing children featured globally across various regional versions, including the UK, Canada, Australia, and a Spanish version featured on the show Quien Sabe Dónde, which focused on missing children in Spanish-speaking countries. Its widespread exposure on platforms like MTV significantly boosted public awareness and directly contributed to the recovery of multiple children. Runaway Train became a groundbreaking example of how music and media could be harnessed for social activism, blending emotional storytelling with real-world action to help solve cold cases. The song's global reach made a significant impact, leading to the recovery of 21 children. However, not all recoveries led to joyful reunions, as some children had fled abusive or traumatic situations and did not want to be found. Among the children, Dina McNichol and Vicky Hamilton were featured in the UK version of the video. In 2007, their remains were discovered in the garden of Scottish serial killer Peter Tobin. Andrea Bowman, featured in the US version, disappeared in 1989, and in 2020, her adopted father confessed to her murder. Despite the video's success, as of 2019, 11 children featured in the video remain unaccounted for. These include Andrea Durham, last seen at her Florida apartment in 1990, Byron Page, who vanished from Los Angeles in 1992, and Christopher Kersey, who disappeared from his home in Minnesota in 1990. A particularly powerful story comes from Elizabeth Wiles, now known as Liz Vadovac, who shared her experience as one of the missing children featured in the video during an interview with Zuri Hall. At 13 years old, Liz ran away from home with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Ron. They hitchhiked from California and lived under the radar for nearly 2 years, renting a small one-bedroom apartment while Liz kept low profile to avoid drawing attention due to her youthful appearance. Unbeknownst to Liz, Soul Asylum's frontman Dave Pirner was collaborating with director Tony Kaye on the music video. Inspired by the idea of missing children featured on milk cartons, they aimed to use the video to help find real missing children. When the video was released, Liz saw herself featured while visiting a friend's house. The sight terrified her, and her boyfriend suggested it might be time to consider going home. A shocking realization for Liz, whose entire life had revolved around being with him. Overwhelmed by fear and emotions, Liz tried to take her own life. Fortunately, a friend intervened just in time, and Liz was taken to the hospital, where she called her mother for the first time in years to let her know she was alive and safe. Returning home proved difficult for Liz. The first 5 to 10 years were marked by struggles as she tried to find her place in life. It wasn't until she met her husband that she began to feel valued and secure. For years, Liz hid her past, fearing judgment for the mistakes she had made. Eventually, she realized that sharing her story could help others dealing with similar struggles. What initially seemed like a painful reminder of her past became a source of healing and hope for both Liz and other families affected by missing persons cases. The Runaway Train video stands as a testament to the power of media to create life-changing impacts and bring attention to those who need it most. Ashley Ann Carlson was born on January 28, 1992 in Hilo, Hawaii, to her mother Tessa Carlson. By the time she was 7 years old, she was living in Astoria, Oregon, just a little girl full of innocence and trust. On February 11, 1999, Ashley went with 16-year-old Patrick Lee Harned to his house in Astoria. He was someone she knew, a neighbor, someone who had even babysat her before. But that night, Patrick took Ashley's life. He strangled her and hid her body in a box under the floorboards of his basement. He was just a teenager himself, but the crime was brutal and deliberate. At one point, he pulled her body out again and later admitted in court that he thought about sexually abusing her remains. As her family and the community desperately searched for Ashley, Harned shockingly joined in those efforts. Eventually, the truth came out. In 2000, he was convicted on 2 counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Later, while in prison, he legally changed his name to Jesse Payne Reyna, and now, decades later, his case is back under scrutiny. Near the end of her term, former Oregon Governor Kate Brown advocated for a wave of clemency and commutations, specifically for individuals who were juveniles at the time of their crimes. Her goal was to give second chances in cases where young offenders had experienced significant trauma or showed evidence of rehabilitation. This shift followed a 2019 law in Oregon that allowed judges to consider a person's age and life circumstances when sentencing juveniles who committed Measure 11 offenses, crimes like murder and sexual assault that carry mandatory minimums. But the move drew sharp backlash from victims' families and some prosecutors who felt justice was being undone. Among those cases is that of Jesse Payne Reyna. His attorney, Jody Davis, described him as a broken child when he killed Ashley, pointing to severe trauma, cognitive and developmental delays, and years of abuse. Records from the parole board confirmed Payne Reyna had been sexually abused by male family members when he was young. After being kicked out of his home, he was placed to live with a registered child sex offender where he was sexually assaulted again. Experts said he had the mental capacity of a third grader when he murdered Ashley. Now 40 years old, he told the board he's learned empathy and has been working on anger management and mental health while in prison. He described that day in 1999 as an explosion of rage, one he says he didn't know how to control. And while no one seems to deny that the system failed him as a child, including Child Protective Services, the question remains. Does that failure excuse what he did to Ashley? Her mother sat through the unimaginable in court, hearing again and again how her daughter was choked with both his hands and a belt, hidden away like trash, and then later disturbed for unthinkable reasons. That kind of trauma doesn't fade with time. As the parole board weighs Payne Reyna's fate, Ashley's family continues to live with a wound that never healed. Danielle Adeline Houchins was born on November 11th, 1980 to Cheryl and Rex Houchins. Everyone called her Danny. At 15, she was living in Belgrade, Montana, and she loved the outdoors, fishing, hiking, and dancing at street fairs. On the morning of September 21st, 1996, after a minor argument at home, Danny asked her mom if she could take a breather at the Cameron Bridge fishing access. Her mom said yes, and Danny headed out in blue jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and a knee brace from a recent dance injury. That was the last time anyone saw her. When she didn't come home, her family raced out to find her. They found her truck parked, unlocked, keys and water bottle lying nearby. But Danny was gone. Search and rescue teams and volunteers combed the area until dark. 2 local brothers kept looking, and about 45 minutes later, one of them found her, face down in shallow water. The initial autopsy ruled it a drowning and marked the manner of death as undetermined. No charges, no suspects. But her sister Stephanie, just 12 at the time, knew something wasn't right. Danny had bruises, scratches, signs of a struggle, mud in her lungs and stomach. Her clothes were disheveled. Her gold watch was halfway up her arm. All signs pointed to foul play. Her family never stopped fighting. In 2019, Stephanie pushed to reopen the case. The new sheriff, Dan Springer, took it on in 2021 and brought in fresh eyes, including retired LAPD Captain Tom Elfmont and DNA specialist Sergeant Court Deepweg to re-examine everything. Here's where science changed the game. Back in '96, investigators collected for arm hairs, but they had no roots, which meant the DNA was considered useless. Rootless hairs couldn't give a genetic profile then. But now, thanks to advanced forensic genome sequencing, those exact hairs gave enough DNA for a full profile. That was passed along to genealogist C.C. Moore, who pieced together a family tree pointing to one man, Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson. Paul was 55, married with 2 adult kids, and worked as a fisheries biologist for the Bureau of Land Management in Dillon, Montana, 22 years on the job. No criminal or traffic history. He'd gone to Montana State University in 1996 for graduate studies. Nothing in his life screamed danger. No connection to Danny. He was just there. On July 23, 2024, detectives interviewed him outside his BLM office. He was visibly shaken, sweating, scratching, chewing on his hand. When shown Danny's picture, he slumped. They later said he acted erratic, like he thought he was being followed. Less than 12 hours later, just before dawn, he called for help and then took his own life next to his truck on the side of the road. After his death, investigators collected his DNA and it matched Danny's case profile perfectly. A full 100% confirmation, no doubt left. Authorities believe Paul didn't know Danny. This was a random crime of opportunity. He happened upon her alone, assaulted her, and forced her head under until she suffocated. Stephanie said it plainly, "He forcefully and violently sexually assaulted my sister, then held her head down until she choked to death on mud." He never faced a court, but the truth came out. In August 2024, Danny's cause of death was officially changed to homicide. For nearly 30 years, her family waited. They got justice, not the courtroom kind, but the truth. That matters. In the aftermath, Paul's wife, Christy, shared in his obituary that she was heartbroken, had never any hint he was capable of this, and said their family was reeled by the news. Kenneth Elton Herring was born on November 17, 1956 to Willie and Bernice Herring. At 62 years old, Kenneth lived in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was known by his family as a playful, joking older brother who loved to leave funny messages on his sister's answering machine. But in May of 2019, a moment of medical distress led to a confrontation that would end his life and cost another their freedom. On a spring day in Clayton County, Georgia, Kenneth was behind the wheel of his Dodge Dakota pickup truck when he reportedly ran a red light and collided with a semi-truck. It was a minor traffic accident. No injuries, no major damage. But Kenneth didn't wait for authorities. Witnesses later said he appeared dazed and disoriented, circling his truck for 15 to 20 minutes before driving away. What no one at the time fully realized was that Kenneth was suffering from a diabetic medical emergency. One of the bystanders at the scene was 21-year-old Hannah Payne. Though she wasn't involved in the accident, Payne pulled over and dialed 911. All right, what were the kind of vehicles involved? The red Dakota off-brand, the red one. In the moments that followed, made a choice that would change her life forever. Despite being told 4 separate times by the 911 dispatcher not to follow Kenneth, Payne got in her Jeep and gave chase. Minutes ago for an accident and no one has shown up yet. He ran the red light, is drunk, and he's gotten back in his car and he's looking like he's trying to drive away. Okay, can you get his tag number? I'm driving away. Oh, it's a red Dakota. So he is going down west. Down. No, I'm sorry. Now for Parkway. Okay, so you couldn't get the same number? No, but I'm catching up to him right now. Okay, man, we actually do not want you to chase him. We just want you to be safe. Oh, I understand. I understand 100%. I'm just going to get the tag number if nothing else. Going west. What Payne didn't know or refused to consider was that Kenneth wasn't intoxicated. He was in medical crisis. As she called up to him, she used her car to box his vehicle in at an intersection. Witnesses said what happened next was fast and aggressive. Payne jumped out of her Jeep and marched up to Kenneth's driver's side window, yelling and pounding on the glass. She demanded that he return to the crash site. According to Payne, the situation escalated quickly. She testified that Kenneth reached out of his truck, grabbed her shirt and wrist, and dragged her partially into the vehicle as he tried to drive off. She claimed she showed him her handgun and tried to push him away with it, insisting she never had her finger on the trigger. As he's pulling it, she said that's when the trigger went off. But eyewitnesses told a different story. According to multiple people on the scene, Payne ran up to Kenneth's truck, cursed at him, began striking him through the open window, and then pulled out her weapon. She threatened to shoot him, they said twice, and then she did. A bystander captured a photo of the encounter, showing Payne holding the firearm with her finger visibly on the trigger. Kenneth was shot in the abdomen. He slumped over in the passenger seat and died at the scene. Police and medics arrived shortly after. Payne, still on the phone, calmly handed her weapon to an officer. Body cam footage later showed the aftermath. Kenneth unresponsive in his truck. At her trial in 2023, Payne testified in her own defense. She claimed she was only trying to help and that she believed she was acting under the direction of a Georgia Corrections officer at the original crash scene who had allegedly told her to go. That officer testified as well, saying Kenneth showed signs of diabetic shock, not drunkenness, and that Payne had made assumptions. Those assumptions, the prosecution argued, turned deadly. Prosecutors accused Payne of playing vigilante, of ignoring law enforcement, and of acting on unfounded suspicions. They argued that Kenneth was confused, disoriented, and vulnerable, and that Payne's pursuit and aggression led directly to his death. She was, they said, trying to play cop. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. Payne was convicted on all counts: malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and 3 counts of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, but not before serving at least 43 years behind bars. In the courtroom, Kenneth's family cried as the verdict was read. His sister Jacqueline said she felt a wave of relief, though she still wished Payne had received life without parole, just as her brother had received death without parole. In the aftermath of the trial, both families received disturbing death threats, prompting an investigation by the district attorney's office. In the end, Kenneth Elton Herring, a man simply trying to make it home while experiencing a diabetic episode, lost his life. Hannah Payne, a woman who refused to stand down, lost her future, and a community was left to mourn what might have been avoided if only someone had listened. Sadie Carlina Robinson was born on May 10, 2004 in Vicksburg, Mississippi, to Carlos Robinson and Sheena Scarborough. She spent her early years between Mississippi and Florida, eventually settling in Milwaukee before she was even 2. Her life was full of movement, but also full of promise. She was smart, kind, ambitious, and focused on creating a future for herself. After high school, she enrolled at Milwaukee Area Technical College to pursue a degree in criminal justice. She worked 2 jobs while attending school and had plans to join the U.S. Air Force after graduation. She was set to receive her associate degree on her birthday, May 10, 2024. She would have turned 20 that day. Sadie had this calm, friendly energy that made people feel comfortable around her. She was funny, sweet, and the type of person you just wanted to root for. On April 1, 2024, she went on a first date with 34-year-old Maxwell Anderson, bartender she'd recently met. They went to Twisted Fisherman for seafood, then stopped at Duke's on Water for drinks. Surveillance footage and text messages confirmed everything. They seemed to be having a good night, but it would be the last time anyone saw her alive. She never returned home. When she didn't answer calls or show up for work the next day, her friends knew something was wrong. On April 2nd, a severed leg with pink toenail polish washed up along Lake Michigan at Warnemont Park. Later that day, her burned-out Honda Civic was found near 30th and Lisbon. More remains were discovered in the days that followed. An arm, a torso, a foot. Some were found near playgrounds and shorelines. Her head and one arm were never recovered. The details of what happened that night are horrifying. Investigators discovered that after returning to Anderson's home around 9:30 p.m., surveillance footage showed activity in his backyard for over an hour. Then, just after midnight, Sadie's phone moved away from the house, along with her car. She was never seen again. The next morning, her car was seen on surveillance with fogged-up windows. A few hours later, it was found torched, the trunk open. Inside, police later found charred human remains and strands of hair. Maxwell Anderson was arrested on April 4th. When police searched his home, they uncovered a basement lined with plastic, restraints, saws, and gloves. There was even a hidden compartment under the bathroom sink. They found blood on the bedding, clothing that wasn't his and women's items. It was described as a sex dungeon, and the evidence was overwhelming. On his phone, investigators discovered disturbing images of Sadie, some taken after she was incapacitated, others showing her dismembered body. Prosecutors called them trophy photos. He had told someone weeks earlier that he wanted to kill a woman. As the investigation unfolded, friends, family, and even Anderson's ex-girlfriend came forward with more details. She had dated him until 2023 and told police about secret hiding spaces in his house and a remote beach he frequented. That beach would later become central to the timeline. From Life 360 data and surveillance footage to forensic evidence, every piece pointed back to him. Sadie's DNA was found on Anderson's clothing. A hoodie he wore after setting her car on fire was found in a neighbor's trash bin. His trial began in late May 2025. Prosecutors called over 250 witnesses, detectives, forensic experts, friends, and family. The timeline was airtight. The defense tried to raise doubt, arguing there was no DNA on the murder weapon, no definitive cause of death, and questioned whether this was premeditated. But the jury wasn't buying it. On June 6, 2025, after just 36 minutes of deliberation, Maxwell Anderson was found guilty on all counts. First-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, hiding a corpse, and arson. He now faces a mandatory life sentence with formal sentencing scheduled for August 16, 2025. Sadie's family had waited over a year for this moment. Her mother, Sheena, said it best. "My baby solved her own case. I demanded justice." Michael Douglas Shaver was born on January 14, 1982 in New York. By his early 30s, he and his wife Lori were raising two children in Claremont, Florida. Michael worked as a monorail technician at Walt Disney World, while Lori worked from home for an insurance company. In his spare time, Michael loved racing airplanes with the local flight team called Precious Metal. On November 7, 2015, Michael, Lori, their kids, and his coworker Frank Merritt went to a local tractor show. Frank remembered Michael acting normally, but Lori seemed distant and cold. The tension between them was hard to miss. The Shavers left the event early. The very next day, Frank received a text, supposedly from Michael, saying he was quitting his job at Epcot to save his marriage. But investigators would later determine it wasn't Michael at all. It was Lori, using his phone to send those messages and create the impression he'd simply walked away. When Michael's boss reached out, another message came through, this time saying he was in Georgia and wouldn't be coming back to work anytime soon. Again, it wasn't Michael, it was Lori covering for his absence. Just days later, Frank went by the house to check in. Lori answered the door and told him that Michael had stormed off after a fight and gone to Georgia. For over 2 years, friends and family only heard from Michael through scattered text and Facebook posts. They were short, strange messages. "Leave me alone. I don't have family." In reality, every one of them came from Lori. Family members said it was completely unlike Michael not to contact his children. Lori, meanwhile, told people he had abandoned her, wasn't paying child support, and started a new life. But Michael's friend Scott Amatuccio realized nobody had actually seen him in years. Then he noticed something disturbing. In Michael's backyard, where he had once started digging a pond for his kids, a large concrete slab now sat. Lori had even bragged on Facebook about turning it into a fire pit in 2016, then expanded it with fresh concrete in 2017. By February 2018, Scott couldn't shake the suspicion. He called the Lake County Sheriff's Office and specifically told them to check that slab. Deputies arrived and immediately noticed it was sunken, the kind of dip that can happen when something decomposes beneath concrete. When they asked to bring in cadaver dogs, Lori told them no. Investigators dug into Michael's records. No valid driver's license, no financial activity, no renewal of his pilot's license. Friends also told investigators that while Michael's Facebook account was active, there were no new photos of him, only suspicious posts, leading them to believe someone else was managing his profile. They also learned that shortly after Michael vanished, Lori began dating a married man named Jeremy Townsend. When Jeremy's wife Vanessa suddenly received messages, and even flowers, supposedly from Michael exposing the affair, it was clear Lori was impersonating her husband. When that relationship ended, Lori moved on to another man, Travis Filmer. They held a small ceremony in her backyard, just steps from where Michael's body lay. Deputies later noted that because Lori was never legally divorced from Michael, that marriage wasn't even valid. On March 9, 2018, detectives returned with a warrant. While breaking apart the fire pit, they uncovered a human arm bone beneath the slab. As they dug deeper, they found remains wrapped in a tarp and a fitted sheet. It was Michael. He had been shot once in the back of the head with a .38 caliber handgun. The Shavers had a history of violence even before this. In September 2014, deputies had been called when both Michael and Lori pulled guns on each other. Twice, Lori filed protective injunctions against Michael, and twice she dropped them. In September 2020, Lori was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. She posted bond and returned home, but the story only grew stranger. After her arrest, her then 12-year-old daughter, Isabel, came forward. She claimed that when she was 7 years old, she had grabbed her mother's gun and shot her father to protect Lori during a violent fight. At other times, she claimed Jeremy Townsend showed up, fired the shot, and threatened the family into silence. Jeremy denied ever being there. Prosecutors pointed out the glaring holes. If Lori wasn't responsible, why had she spent years pretending Michael was alive, managing his Facebook, even opening credit accounts in his name? In September 2024, Lori went to trial. Isabel testified in her defense, but the jury didn't believe the shifting story. Prosecutors argued Lori acted alone, buried Michael in the backyard, and staged an elaborate deception to cover her crime. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before convicting her of second-degree murder. At sentencing, prosecutors urged the judge to impose life, saying Lori's lies and the concealment of Michael's body were undeniable proof of guilt. Defense attorneys countered, pointing to the circumstantial nature of the case and alleging abuse in the marriage, asking for only the 25-year minimum. In the end, the court sided with the jury's verdict and she was sentenced to life in prison. Michael Shaver was just 33 years old when his life was stolen. A father, a husband, a man who worked at Disney while chasing his love of racing planes, silenced and hidden beneath the backyard he once shared with his family. It all began in the spring of 2024 when Aaron Spencer's daughter was just 13 years old. She was homeschooled and was described as a quiet individual. She was also helping her mother care for her dying grandpa. Because that came with a lot of stress, her mother allowed her to spend time with trusted family friends in order to get a break. One of those family friends was dating 66-year-old Michael Fossler, who was a veteran former police chief in Indiana and former school resource officer. Unfortunately, he had an ulterior motive. He obtained Aaron's daughter's phone number and began texting her, and that's how the grooming began. By July, her parents were informed by a family member that their now 14-year-old daughter had confided that she had been sexually assaulted. Immediately, her parents asked what had happened, and she explained that Fossler, whom they weren't familiar with, had assaulted her sexually multiple times. They quickly turned to authorities for help and were promised that things would be taken seriously and that Fossler would be held accountable. At first, it appeared he was. He was quickly arrested and charged with 2 counts of internet stalking, 2 counts of 4th-degree sexual assault, 2 counts of sexual indecency with a child, possession of a computer with inappropriate material involving children, and 35 counts of pandering, or possessing media depicting sexual conduct with a child. Even with all those charges, the judge allowed him to be released on a $5,000 cash bail with no supervision. While this made the Spencer family nervous, they figured his felony charges and the no-contact order would be enough to keep him away. Sadly, that's not how things played out. Meanwhile, Heather put her daughter into therapy and tried her best to manage her trauma, while still caring for her own dying father. Then, on October 8, 2024, everything came crashing down. At about 1:12 a.m., Aaron and Heather were awakened by their dog barking. Heather immediately asked Aaron to go check on their daughter, and they were shocked to find her gone. Heather called 911 while the rest of the family looked around the house for her. Then Aaron received a text from his sister, which included a photo of a cash-out payment for DoorDash from Fossler to Aaron and Heather's daughter a day or two before. That's when they realized he most likely was involved in their daughter's disappearance. Aaron, desperate to find her, rushed out of the house, got into his vehicle, and began searching for her. Before the police could arrive, Aaron located Fossler's white Ford F-150, turning onto Highway 236 east toward Fossler's home. He turned around and chased after Fossler's vehicle, flashing his lights and honking his horn to get Fossler to pull over. When the two vehicles arrived at the intersection of Highways 236 east and 13 north, rammed his truck into the rear of Fossler's, sending the F-150 into the ditch. Aaron stated that he exited his vehicle with his firearm in hand and ordered Fossler out of his vehicle and to lie down in the ditch. He said he then observed his daughter trying to exit the passenger side of the vehicle, but it appeared that Fossler had grabbed her and stopped her from getting out. Aaron then stated that Fossler exited his vehicle and had something in his hand, but Aaron didn't know what it was. He said all of a sudden Fossler lunged towards him saying, "You." Aaron reacted by pistol whipping Fossler before shooting him multiple times, fatally injuring him. Once Aaron felt the threat was over, he got his daughter out of the vehicle and returned to his truck, where he called 911 and told them about the events that just unfolded. Investigators determined that Aaron shot Fossler in the chest, arms, and abdomen. It's likely that had Aaron not stopped Fossler, he would have never seen his daughter again. While most people saw Aaron as a hero, the state disagreed and charged him with first-degree murder, which was later downgraded to second-degree murder with a firearm enhancement. Apparently, Fossler had other victims as well, but no justice was ever served in their cases either, and he was allowed to continue his crimes against children. The first accusation against him came in 2022, after his wife of 44 years passed away and continued from there. Thankfully, he can never hurt another innocent child again. While the Spencer family now tries to pick up the pieces, they are left in agony over Aaron's arrest. It doesn't help that his murder trial is being overseen by Judge Barbara Elmore, who allowed Fossler to go free on such a low bond. She also strangely issued a gag order in the case, preventing the defendant, attorneys, law enforcement, and potential witnesses from speaking about the case and sealed the entire court file. Many are calling her gag order unconstitutional. Before the gag order was put into place, Aaron's attorneys, Aaron Casanelli and Michael Kaiser of Little Rock, released a statement saying that Aaron was not a criminal for protecting his child from a predator who repeatedly violated her. After his attorneys spoke out in support of Aaron is when the judge implemented the gag order. On May 29, 2025, the Arkansas Supreme Court vacated Judge Barbara Elmore's broad gag order. Several justices filed unusually strong concurrences criticizing how the case was handled, with one justice explicitly urging reassignment to a different judge. However, the court rejected the reassignment and Elmore remains the judge on the case. As of now, the pretrial is scheduled for December 17, 2025, with a jury trial set for January 26 to January 30, 2026. Other judges have also been critical of Judge Elmore's decision to implement a gag order, especially one that was far too broad and too restrictive of speech, unconstitutionally vague, and could even prohibit the speech of any public official now holding office. Other judges also noted a troubling pattern of attempts to shield this case from public view. Heather has stated that more than $100,000 has been raised for her husband's legal fees in less than a week, and any additional funds will be donated directly to the Wade Knox Children's Advocacy Center. Kathleen Ruth Smiley was born on May 22, 1957 in Florida and went by Kathy. By 1974, 16-year-old Kathy was now living in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, where she was known as a friendly, warm, spirited, and ambitious girl. She had moved with her family to the area a few years prior after spending time overseas. She was a senior at Lakeside High School in DeKalb County, where she was recognized for her academic drive, taking extra classes to graduate a year early. Kathy had big dreams, initially aspiring to become a veterinarian, but later considered teaching as a career. Despite her ambitions, Kathy's life was shaped by the complexities of her family circumstances. Her parents, Dale and Jacqueline Smiley, had recently separated, and her father had moved to Minneapolis for his job. Kathy, her younger sister Patricia, and their mother had stayed behind in Atlanta. Regardless of his relocation, Kathy's father, a corporate marketing representative for Gillette, was still a significant part of her life. The weekend of April 20th, 1974, was when Kathy was looking forward to because her father planned to visit for a family day at Lake Lanier, where they would picnic and swim. The morning after arriving, Kathy and Patricia drove to a Denny's restaurant to meet their father for breakfast. Kathy had just turned 16 the previous year and was given a red 1972 Volkswagen Beetle as a gift. After breakfast, Kathy's father agreed to take Patricia with him to the lake while Kathy was to go home to retrieve her swimsuit and water skis. Sadly, it was the last time Patricia and her father saw Kathy alive. After parting ways at the restaurant, Kathy made a quick phone call to her mother, letting her know that she would be heading home soon to grab a few things before joining them at the lake, but she never returned. Kathy's path took her to an access road near Interstate 85, where she encountered two men, Pinckney Thomas Mitchell and Wallace Charles Lanford, both fugitives from North Carolina. They were looking for a way to get back to their home state, having recently escaped their respective troubles. Mitchell and Lanford, both in their early 20s, were desperate for money and drugs. After meeting Kathy, they convinced her to help them by offering her some gas for her car in exchange for a ride to North Carolina. Kathy, trusting or simply not thinking of the danger, agreed. She drove her red Volkswagen to a nearby Shell service station on Shellaford Road, where the men bought gas. A clerk recalled that Mitchell, who seemed fidgety and out of place, was acting oddly as he asked about the route to Lake Lanier and North Carolina, requesting a map of the area. At the same station, Mitchell took a rope from the ground, secretly pocketing it as he made small talk. After filling the car, Kathy, Mitchell, and Lanford drove away from the station unaware of the impending violence. Somewhere between Shallowford Road and the exit toward Lake Lanier, the two men overpowered Kathy. They pulled her off the road and drove her to Gaston County, North Carolina. Once there, they took her into a wooded area near the old Lincoln Academy where they sexually assaulted her. In a statement later given to authorities, described how he had sexually assaulted Kathy before Lanford took his turn. The violence escalated and Mitchell, fueled by drugs and anger, viciously attacked Kathy, stabbing her repeatedly. After killing her, they tied her lifeless body to a tree, leaving it in the woods as they drove away. They returned to the area hours later, where they attempted to cover up their crime by burning Kathy's car and disposing of the evidence. Mitchell, in the presence of Lanford, later bragged to his brother-in-law Stuart about what they had done. He admitted to the murder, describing it as a big one. This confession was later used against them during their trial. Kathy's body was found later that afternoon, about 5 hours after she was last seen. Her body was discovered by a passerby near the old Lincoln Academy, where she had been left dead, bound and gagged with an electrical cord. The brutality of the crime shocked the local community. The Volkswagen, which the men had set ablaze, was discovered burned beyond recognition. Their subsequent attempt to cover up their involvement failed, and soon the police had enough evidence to arrest them. During their trial, it was revealed that Mitchell had a criminal history. He had previously been convicted of crimes such as traffic offenses, assault, and larceny, and had escaped from a correctional facility in North Carolina. Despite the chilling details of the murder, the defendant's defense strategies varied. Mitchell claimed he didn't remember killing Kathy, attributing the violence to a drug-induced haze, but his statements and actions left little room for doubt. Lanford, although admitting to being present at the scene, denied participating in the assault, but his presence and the evidence pointed to his complicity in the crime. In the end, both were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. However, the death sentences were later commuted to life in prison. Both Mitchell and Lanford have since passed while still in prison. The haunting nature of her death, combined with the eerie atmosphere of the Lincoln Academy site, led to rumors that Kathy's spirit still lingered in the woods, a tragic figure trapped by the violence she suffered. In the 40 years following her death, the location where Kathy was killed has become infamous, with many visitors reporting strange occurrences and an overwhelming sense of sorrow hanging over the area. Whether these reports are rooted in truth or simply the product of a community's grief and fear, Kathy's memory has lived on. Though the murderers were eventually caught, the emotional toll of Kathy's brutal killing continued to echo through her community for decades. The horror of that day on April 21, 1974, is one that still lingers in the hearts of those who knew her.